We live in a world where there is more access to information than ever before. Generations, young and old, are being exposed to radically different ideologies and opinions every day. It can be so overwhelming, trying to decipher what's true and what's false. But there is a way. Join me as we discuss some of the toughest questions out there about Christianity, the Bible, and culture. I'm your host, Nick Lackey. Welcome to The Garrison. Welcome everybody to another episode of The Garrison. I'm super excited because today I have my good friend and mentor Brendan Malone with us, and we are going to be talking about abortion, which is it's probably the most controversial topic that has been covered on The Garrison so far. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. Brendan has been talking about this issue and training people on the answers to the tricky questions about abortion for many, many years now. I've greatly benefited from learning from him, and he's also got a few ministries of his own which he runs. So Brendan, do you want to tell us about yourself and then what you do?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Nick, for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be on the show. I love seeing new social media initiatives, and this is great. So yeah, thank you. Well, what do? I run an organisation called the LifeNet Charitable Trust, and I have been, as you've said, have been working in this space around bioethics, and this is, questions about abortion, euthanasia, human sexuality, at the sort of the intersection of ethics and medicine, and I guess the big controversial issues that people sometimes don't like to talk about, and then other times just like to scream about. So I've been doing that for 20 years now, and I run a pro-life training week here in New Zealand twice a year. I started that with a couple of other people 13 years ago. So it's been running every year now, and often I get asked to go into Australia and run it there as well. And aside from that, I also run my own initiative called Left Foot Media, and we've got podcasting and video stuff and things like that we do as well. So it's all in all pretty busy, plus being a dad with 5 kids. It's all on.
Oh, cool. Awesome. Thanks, Brendan. And maybe at the end of the show, I'll get you to share with how people can go and maybe check out some of your content as well, because sure. I know I do, and I really love the stuff that you put out, Brendan. So anyway, I think we should get into it. So first question, Brendan, before we get into the heart of it, I guess it's pretty obvious to people listening and watching that we're 2 men right now, and we're going to have a conversation about abortion. So a common objection is to the pro-life movement, men shouldn't have opinions on abortion because it's not our bodies that are being affected. So in your opinion, what gives us the right to be having a conversation about abortion?
Well, I don't see it so much as a right. I sort of see it as like an obligation and a part of our humanity. Like this idea that men shouldn't speak about abortion, I've never accepted that. And it's not just because I'm a bloke. It's always been nonsensical, because how do you end up with new human beings? How do you create new life? You have to have a male involved in that process. And so it's just really strange. And then, of course, after the child is born, if the child is allowed to live, what do you want? You want a dad present and loving and committed. And so to sort of have this weird 9-month window where it's like, no, you shut your mouth and you've got no rights and you're not allowed to say anything, that never made any sense to me. So I don't buy into that, because it's really built on an idea about humanity that's not correct. And the idea is this, and you hear it in the slogan, my body, my choice. The false idea is that we're all just radical individuals. We're autonomous, we choose our own way, and everyone's just their own little individual. But we're not. We are communal by nature. We are born into community. We can't exist without community. A community, our mum and our dad, gave rise to our existence. We need community around us to nurture us when we're young and when we're very old and frail, or if we have disabilities, for example. And we can't flourish without community. If I don't have at least one other friend who really is an authentic and genuine friend, I don't have that sort of community, I can't flourish as a human being. So we're not individuals at all. We're communal. And what that means is we should care about what happens to each other. And I shouldn't look at you and say, well, you know what, you're not exactly like me, so you're not a male, or you're not a female, or you're not a child, or you're not someone with disability, so I don't care about you. We should look at each other and recognise that the first and most important thing is our humanity, our personhood, and that's what unites us together. And so as a bloke, I have a common humanity with a mother who's pregnant and who's maybe afraid and stressed in the midst of that, and all the challenges and fears of that. And also I have a common humanity with the unborn child. And like I often like to remind people, once upon a time, I was a child in a womb myself. And when my mother was pregnant with me, if she'd had an abortion, it would have been me that would have had my life lost. And I hope that men and women would have been around to advocate for me in that situation. And I think most ludicrously of all, I guess, is the notion that you have to be able to experience something in order to have a voice on it. That's simply not true.
Yeah.
William Wilberforce, some of your viewers, listeners, may be aware of him, the great champion of ending the transatlantic slave trade and having slavery outlawed in Britain. Amazing guy. But he was white. He was wealthy. He was never, ever going to need to own slaves or be a slave himself. Yeah. He's not African, but he's one of the strongest voices and everyone respects him for it. So the idea that you have to live something to have a voice on it, that just is not true. And I guess most importantly of all too is that we're not talking about pregnancy here. It's about abortion, and abortion is something that happens to an unborn child. So if I got up and I said to you, I know all about pregnancy, and I can tell you, well, I don't know all about pregnancy because I have never experienced it and I can't experience that. But we're not talking about pregnancy. The ethical question is about what happens to an unborn child with an abortion. And so the question is, it's not pregnancy we're talking about, it's which is a uniquely feminine experience. It's abortion, which is something else altogether. It's something that happens to the unborn child.
Oh, cool. I think that's a great answer. And if you're a man listening, just know that you can speak up about this and you can have an opinion. So,
well, I think, to be honest with you too, I think if most women, ordinary, everyday, 9 to 5 women, who are, that sounds weird, I know, but just who are not sort of caught up in really extreme ideologies or activism. I believe that if you sat down and talked with them, they will tell you they want the men in their lives to actually be virtuous and caring and nurturing and protecting.
Yeah.
They don't want them to be distant. They don't want them to abandon them or to say, you're on your own now, you're pregnant. And so this sort of attitude, I think, goes against that very thing that I think most women would want. They want men to be involved and be caring and nurturing.
Yeah, cool. No, that's awesome, Brendan. So with that out of the way, with, I guess, people knowing that as men we can talk about this, what would be your first defense for being pro-life? In other words, if you started a conversation with someone and they were, let's say, pro-abortion, they were all for it, and they wanted to know what you thought about abortion and why you disagreed with them, what would be your kind of go-to argument?
Well, it's an interesting question, and for me, it's actually developed and matured quite a bit as I've had children of my own. And I'll tell you why, because when you have children of your own, these arguments all of a sudden take on a very real human dimension. You have your own child and you see them on that that sonogram when you go to the ultrasound appointment, and then you're there in the hospital when they're being born, and you hold them in your arms and you realize, wow, these aren't just arguments about abstract things. Like, it's a real human being. Abortion ends real human lives. It became very real very suddenly. And so there's a sort of almost like a humanitarian sort of awareness that you develop only through experience that sort of really strengthens the position, I think.
Yeah.
It's almost like sometimes I say to people, look, you understand once you have your own children, it's almost like you're not even making an argument. You're just talking about the humanity of the experience. But the arguments themselves, the logic of it, is still just as strong, and this only strengthens that logic. I think the first thing I'd say to someone is, well, the reason I'm pro-life is because I've looked at all the arguments, and I really have. I've studied the arguments on both sides of this debate. And the arguments for the pro-choice, or even now the radical pro-abortion position, which are even worse, they are so weak, I think, that they don't hold water. I think all of the evidence, all of the best available human reason, it very clearly points to the pro-life ethic being the correct one. And the most obvious question that I would want anyone to grapple with in this is, well, if we're going to talk about abortion, let's talk about, first of all, what a fetus is. What is that thing growing inside a mother's womb during pregnancy? And if we can't answer that question, we shouldn't be saying, well, let's just destroy it. Yeah. We need to answer what it is before we even get there. And when you grapple with that question, I can't see how you can come to any other conclusion than it is a living, growing, developing human being. It's totally innocent. It hasn't done any harm to us. So what right do we have to mistreat it? Yeah. What right do we have to do harm to it? We don't. Mm-hmm. And so that would be my starting point. And then from there, people would start probably raising various objections, what about viability, or what about it doesn't have consciousness, all those kinds of things. But I'd always start at that point. It's a human being, and the weight of the pro-life arguments, they are really strong. They really are, and they absolutely make sense. Like, as I often say to people, would you do this to a 2-year-old child?
Yeah.
And if you wouldn't do it to a 2-year-old child, why would it be okay to do it to a 6-month-old child in a womb, or a 2-month-old child in a womb?
Yeah.
And if you can't give me a coherent answer to that question, why we should treat the two human beings differently, I think there's a problem in your logic. And so that's why I'm pro-life, ultimately.
Okay, so for a few minutes, can I pretend to be this person
Sure.
who's asking you questions and start raising a few objections? And the first one being that, obviously with you talking about the development of the baby in the womb, and would you do this to a 2-year-old or not? My first objection, I guess, would be, well, it's just a blob of cells, and this is such a common one you hear. So what would be your response?
Well, I would say that's not an argument. That all you're doing is stating a fact about what an unborn child is made of. But it's not just unborn children who are blobs of tissue or clumps of cells. We all are. So you're a blob of tissue as well. So again, why would you treat that blob of tissue differently from you, the blob of tissue, or you, the clump of cells? So all you're telling me is, what is an unborn child made of? It's made of cells and it's made of tissue. Congratulations, you understand basic biology. How should we treat that particular grouping of cells, that particular grouping of tissue? So another grouping of cells is this cup here, or an apple. But we don't give human rights to a cup or an apple, right?
Yeah.
So the question is not what's it made of, what is it? Is it human? Is it one of us? Is it alive? And so that's how I'd respond to that.
Okay, what about the location of the baby, where it is in the world? Does that affect how we should treat it?
Yeah, and that's a common one. And this is one of the big reasons why you get people using the my body, my choice argument. They say, well, it's a human being inside another body. And they would say being inside a womb changes the equation somehow. And I would say it's definitely a different situation to being outside a womb. There's no doubt about that. That, having a child growing in a womb is a very unique and beautiful thing. But the fundamental moral equations don't change just because of your location. So, you don't become less human because you're in a different place than what you were, I don't know, a month ago. You don't get more rights because you're in a different place than what you were a month ago. It's your humanity, not your location. It's your nature. Are you a human being? Are you innocent? And the answer to those questions is yes, an unborn child is human, it is innocent. So the fact that it's in a womb doesn't change that fact. And how should we treat an innocent human being? We should respect and care for them, and respect their most important right of all, their right to life. And I know some people try and sort of spin this argument, and they say, well, look, there's a version of this called the organ donor argument, where they would say, well, if you're you're desperately in need of organs because you're ill or sick, I can't force you to donate your organs to me. So therefore, you shouldn't be able to force a pregnant woman to donate her organs to an unborn child for 9 months. But I would argue there's something very different going on here. We're not just talking about donating organs here, and we're not just talking about saying no to organ donation. So if let's say I was really sick and I said to you, I need a new kidney, and you said, for whatever reason, no, I just can't do that. And you're totally entitled to, morally speaking. There's no problem with that. And let's say I die after that. Did you kill me? No, you didn't. What killed me? My fatal sickness in my body. The disease took my life, not you. But that's not what abortion is. So abortion is not just saying no to giving organs. Abortion involves an abortionist going into a womb and directly targeting and deliberately ending the life of an unborn human being. That's a very different moral equation. And so I think that's really, really important. And of course, the other big factor too in all of this is that how did that child get into the womb? It didn't ask to be put there. It was the overwhelming majority of pregnancies occur because you have men and women who engage freely in consensual sexual acts. And if we engage in the most effective act for bringing a brand new, totally dependent, totally vulnerable human being into existence, then don't we have an obligation to actually care for them because we put them there? And I would say we absolutely do. If I put a vulnerable person into a situation where they're vulnerable, I have an obligation, I believe, to care for them.
And do you think that in today's culture, we've kind of separated getting someone pregnant to having sex? We've kind of separated those two, and we can kind of pick and choose?
Oh, hugely so. And there's no denying that technology plays a huge role in all of this as well. For example, the advent of the contraceptive pill really changed the nature of how we view sexuality and the gift of new life, and it really did in ways that people never probably even imagined happening. Because basically now you had this technological device that allowed us to separate very efficiently using very modern advanced technology, effectively pharmaceutical technology, to separate children from the act of making love. And so that you could have sex without babies, and people naturally thought, well, on the back of that, we can also have babies without sex, and the whole industry of fertility treatments grew out of that. But the key point was this idea, well, if you can have sex without babies, what happens if you conceive a baby and your whole intention was, we wanted the sex but not the babies. Yeah. So I don't want the baby now. And so that really fueled an attitude that enabled, I think, abortion, and really allowed it to grow in a very unhealthy way, and became sort of almost... this extreme normalization happened of the act of abortion. It was like, well, if your contraception fails, just use abortion. The thing that really changed here was we started talking about things like children being unplanned. Yeah. Well, there never was. Originally, the concept of a planned child was pretty foreign for almost all of human history, for the majority of people. You didn't plan your children, you received them as a gift. Yeah. And that dynamic changed. And of course, children also started to become accidents. But as I've said to people like a million times, if you engage in the most effective act for making a brand new, totally dependent, vulnerable human being, and you make a baby, congratulations, that's how it's supposed to work. That's not an accident. It's worked exactly like it's supposed to. But in our mind, we see them as an inconvenience, an accident, a burden, a cost, an unwanted thing. And that really, that separation of sex and babies really did fuel that in a big way for abortion.
Yeah. No, that's good. Really good answers, Brendan. Now, what about in a situation, this is often brought up, what about in a situation where maybe the mother, without having an abortion, will die herself? Is that something that happens where the pregnancy puts the mother's life in risk? And then what would you say about that?
Well, it's an interesting one. There's always these, first of all, what tends to happen is people tend to go to the tricky extremes, and they say, well, let's go to the very fringes of an issue. Let's imagine a scenario in which someone will die if they don't get an abortion. And then they they take a hard case and they say, let's make a moral rule based on hard cases. But as they say in the legal fraternity, like lawyers would say to you, hard cases make bad law. Yeah. So you don't start with the hard cases. You start with what your first principles are. Then you go to the fringes in these situations. You say, well, how might our principles, our good, sound, moral truths and principles, how might they inform our behaviour when we have these hard cases? So that's the first thing. Second thing is, we now are in a situation where, ironically, we have the least justification for the use of abortion, what you might call therapeutic abortion. I don't like that term, but it is a recognised term. We are in a state in our human development where we have the least justification for that, because we have so many life-saving technologies. But we also have widespread abortion on a scale we've never had before. So the very moment we can't justify it, we have more of it than we've ever had. So there's a real problem there. What this means, though, is that our advances in technology are such that we are saving people in situations where once upon a time they would have been quite potentially, well, in a lot of cases, very disastrous. So that's a real beautiful and good thing. Yeah. And so our justifications, it's very rare what that means is to have a situation where someone truly is under threat from pregnancy. We can monitor, we can bring other therapies to bear, we can use things like early intervention with a cesarean section to bring the child into the world earlier. All those kinds of things can be done that we used to be not very good at. Yeah. There are situations though, like, and the very obvious and clear example is that of an ectopic pregnancy, where what happens is the child is conceived, the embryo begins to travel down the fallopian tubes, and instead of getting to the womb and planting in what we call the endometrium, the lining of the womb, the child implants in the fallopian tube somewhere. Now, depending on where the child implants, like we have had examples of people who had ectopic pregnancies where the child implanted close enough to the womb and they carried the child to term, but it's pretty rare. Generally what happens is that's a very serious situation, and you can't let it go on because the unborn child will be trying to grow in the fallopian tube. It's not designed for that purpose, and it grows and grows and grows, and then it ruptures. Yeah. And then what in that situation you can have is you will have the loss of the unborn child and the loss of the mother's life as well. So you've got to take some action. It's a very rare situation where you can't just leave it and hope for the best. But in that situation where you, for example, go in and remove the damaged piece of fallopian tube and in the process the unborn child is lost, the loss of the child is a secondary unintended consequence of your life-saving action.
Yeah.
So an abortion's not that, and so it's not an abortion.
Right.
An abortion, you go in and the sole mission, if you like, of an abortion is to end the life, deliberately, directly end the life of an unborn child. But treating someone to save their life from an ectopic pregnancy and the unintentional, the thing you don't want to happen but happens as a secondary effect is the child is lost because you've got no other way of saving them. That is ethically and morally permissible because it's not an abortion. It's not the same thing at all. Yeah. So there's no doubt there, and I suspect in time there will become more grey issues, because there's an interesting thing we're grappling with at the moment in the world of science, medical science, and that's the looming threat of antibiotic resistance. So what happens if we do develop a tolerance whereby, or I guess the diseases develop a tolerance and antibiotics don't work anymore? And how will that be a game changer? There'll be threats that will come back into pregnancy that we've never known before. And so we'll have to grapple with those in that way as well. But on that point, if you look back in our history, one of the interesting things was, once upon a time, a lot of people didn't actually survive childbirth. It was and so, it seems to me that you could make some sort of argument in a roundabout way. Well, look, back then, because childbirth was pretty risky, your life is at risk with childbirth in a major way. Wouldn't it be okay to abort a child right up to 9 months, just because it happened to have been conceived 100 years ago rather than now? And to me, that doesn't really seem like a particularly logically coherent way to view things. So in the modern context, I think we often we make justifications for abortion that don't really make sense at all. And they are often, if you think about them in the context of history, you realise, this is really arbitrary. It really is arbitrary. We wouldn't say, well, for example, viability is a really clear example of this. So people who make the viability argument say, well, you're either not a human being until you can live independently outside your mother's womb, or you shouldn't get rights and protections until you can live independently outside your mother's womb. Of course, that's not true for an infant, because an infant can't live independently outside its mother's womb, can't clothe, feed, hydrate, shelter, nutrate, right? I'm saying that word right. It can't give itself nutrients and look after itself, right? It needs the body of another human being to keep it alive. But leaving that aside, that point of viability has changed dramatically because of our technology. So we now have saved children. There are human beings walking around today who were born 21 weeks premature. I mean, if you go back 200 years, people would have thought, no, you're lying. It's fantasy. There's no way. Because a lot of babies even died at or during childbirth. Mm-hmm. But that's how far our technology has come now. And so are we going to say, well, if you happen to be conceived, 200 years ago when we didn't have the technology, then you aren't fully human because, you weren't viable at, say, 28 weeks. Yep. But if you're 28 weeks in the womb today, where we do have that technology, we will consider you a human being. It's very arbitrary, you see. Yep. And so I think some of these things have to be considered as well when you think about the question of threats to health and how we respond. Again, that's why if I could really sort of land on this point, start with our first principles. What are our moral truths? Mm-hmm. And then how might they apply in these situations that are challenging, the margins, the grey edges?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I actually had a primary school teacher who I remember her telling us a story about how when she was born, she said she was about the size of a block of butter, and I think she was brought out of the womb, I guess, prematurely to that the normal 40 weeks, and yet she was a perfectly normal functioning human being. And so as you say, I think it's great that we have the technology today to be able to do things that we couldn't do 200 years ago. And so I think that's really awesome. So what about this is something that I think doesn't really get talked about much in the whole debate about abortion, which is what goes on after the abortion, right? When it happens, what are the short and long-term effects on the I don't want to say just the mother, because as we've established, this has effects on more than just the mother. There's the father as well. But in your experience, probably talking more about the mental health of them, what happens short and long term to the mother involved?
Well, it's an interesting question. Every woman is going to be different, and I think you got to recognize that every situation is different, and I think also every life experience is different as well. I think that I've seen some interesting phenomenon, if you like, and they seem to be pretty consistent. One thing is I've seen people who think that having a baby was so extreme and so dangerous and such a burden and such a threat for them that they sort of use that to mask the abortion itself, the effects of the abortion. They try and convince themselves that it would have been better. Interesting thing is that the fact that people are even doing that indicates that they do have a big question mark in their own mind about what went on, about the rightness and the wrongness of it, because you don't really need to keep revisiting something like that and reassuring yourself, do you, if you know truly that something was the right thing to do. So I've seen that kind of experience. I've seen the situation where people almost immediately they realise the gravity of what's happened. Their unborn child has been killed by an abortionist, and the horror and the full gravity of that. I had the privilege of actually interviewing a lady some years ago, and amazing Kiwi woman, had run successfully her own businesses, really competent. You'd say, well, this is a great role model, and you'd put her in front of young girls and say, yeah, this woman can show you, how to really embrace femininity and tackle the world with two hands. And she told me the story about how she had 2 abortions and then she had her 3rd child. And the first two abortions didn't register with her, but when she had her 3rd child, and the 3rd child was carried to term, and she's in the hospital, and the moment they handed her the baby, in that instant, she said to me, she suddenly realised, oh my gosh, and these were her words. She said, I murdered my first 2 children. That was her. That was that in that moment. So it came back. So I've seen that phenomenon, and I've met women actually who sometimes decades later the pain hits then.
Yeah.
So no story is the same, and no, it's very rare to meet people, but there are some cases of it, sadly, and it feels like troublingly a little bit of a growing number. They are the minority, it seems, but there is a growing number of what I would call very callous situations where people are just like, I don't care, or I celebrate this, or we've heard of the social media stories, people who will boast about it online, or who will even take abortion pills live on the camera and live stream and things like that. And thankfully they're rare, but there is a callousness that some people are developing as well, which is not good. And I think the reason that happens is because you have a widespread tolerance of abortion, and so that behaviour, which we formerly considered to be extreme, is now normalised. Well, people go to new extremes that are even worse. So I think it's different, but generally speaking, I don't think you ever get away from abortion scot-free. I have yet to meet a woman, even women who say to me, no, it was fine, it was the best thing I ever did. Once you hear them start unpacking their story a bit more, what you start to discover is their words start to betray the truth, really. And they start saying things that actually indicate that truly they do carry questions at the very least, or some guilt, or some big uncertainty about whether or not they really did do the right thing. So initially they might say, yeah, no, it was the best thing ever and I celebrate this, but then they start talking, well, I had no other choice, and I went through like 5 years of really hard grief and suffering, but it was all worth it. And you're like, that's not really how people talk about having children. They don't say, oh yeah, well, it was awful and it's the worst thing ever, but I'm really glad I did it. They, even when having children is hard, there's something about, people talk about, I wouldn't trade that for the world.
Yeah.
There's something very different that goes on there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's such a big lie when in this culture we tend to say abortion somehow, we use words like freedom and choice, which have, more positive connotations with them, and we connect them with abortion, whereas, as you say, I don't think there is one person who gets away, was it scot-free?
Scot-free, yeah.
Scot-free, yeah.
Well, the thing is too, that freedom, and that's a really good point, because it's sold as autonomy. It's sold as, that's the great lie. It's sold as this will liberate you from your problems, but it doesn't. All it does is add violence to any problems you might be experiencing. And it entangles you in, and probably as a mother, the worst kind of violence. The abortionist has ended the life of your own child, and you've got to carry that violence with you now. And it's an intimate sort of violence that's just awful. And so the important point that I think a lot of people have lost sight of is that authentic freedom is not about the ability to do whatever you want. And in fact, if you think that's what freedom is, you'll actually end up doing harm to yourself. So for freedom to be authentic freedom that really does liberate you and liberates a person and gives them actual release and freedom, it always has to be intimately bound to truth. And if truth and freedom are not connected, then you've just got what you might call license, the license to do whatever you want to.
Yeah.
But what that means is you can do some really dangerous, harmful, evil, harmful things to yourself and to others, and that's not freedom. You're not freeing yourself, you're not freeing other people when you do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, a lot of people will say that pro-life people only want to force people to go have their pregnancies and then deal with the complications of being a mother afterwards. And when I say complications, I mean often people in very hard financial situations or relationship situations. So what are the alternatives for people who maybe aren't prepared to be mothers, but as a pro-lifer, you also think, well, the alternative should not be to go and murder your child. So do you know any, let's say, New Zealand examples of ministries or organizations which are helping the mothers after birth?
Yeah, and a lot of, funnily enough, you hear a lot of talk about crisis pregnancy centres, and help with unplanned pregnancy centres. Like, they're run by pro-lifers. This is one of the great accusations that's made, the negative accusations made about pro-lifers is, oh, you don't care about women in need, and you just want them to have babies, but you don't care about what happens to them. Well, in actual fact, it's only pro-lifers who are running pregnancy centres that care for women while they're pregnant to give them other options. Pro-choicers just say, look, go and have an abortion. You've got a choice. And this is ironically because a lot of what you're talking about here is fueled by bigger social issues, the breakdown of community, the breakdown of family that leaves people isolated and vulnerable and alone. The way we run our economies, there are some big questions there. We've lost virtue in our economies, in our economic dealings. And that has a big impact on people feel like can't afford a child, and all this pressure comes on people. And the option that's presented to them is not, we'll fix the thing and we'll stop behaving this way that causes the pressure. Go and have an abortion. Go into this place of violence and bring violence into your life and think that somehow frees you from a problem we've put you under. So it's not helping. But on the flip side, it's the pro-lifers who are the only ones who are actually addressing that by saying, right, let's set up crisis pregnancy centres that will help women in need, and we'll give them the care that they need, and we'll fund them ourselves, we'll staff them ourselves. Honestly, so many pro-life people I know, they pour blood, sweat, tears, income that they can't even afford to, but they will put it into these centres to make sure that they keep running so that women have genuine options and choices other than the violence of abortion. Now, those same centres, although they're called crisis pregnancy centres, they are also now and have been, I think, for quite some time, consistently journeying with those mothers after the child is born. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that might mean journeying with a mother for life, because some mothers just have such challenging needs and maybe personal issues that are so serious, and over a lifetime, they're not going to ever be resolved before they die, sadly. And that would be the ideal, right? You could help someone and empower them, and they actually stand on their own 2 feet. But sadly, some people will never stand on their own 2 feet. That's why we need community. The breakdown of community has been so disastrous. Because once upon a time, we would have recognised that. We would have just said, oh, okay, that's Janice or that's Jim, and they've got some challenges and struggles, but they're a part of the community too, and we get alongside them and help them. But once we see ourselves as radical, autonomous individuals, what happens to Janice and Jim? They get trodden over, basically. And they get told, well, come on, improve yourself, and if you can't, you're on your own. So some of these mothers will struggle with some of these things for life, and they'll need that kind of support. And normally it would have been their families that would have done that. And for whatever situation, often now it's pregnancy centres or even churches who are attached to these ministries who will journey with them. Other women, they will just need maybe the first couple of years or the first 5 years or the first year or so, and they just find their feet. And then they start finding a bit of a community. They find their strength as a mother, and they sort of go from there. So often it's actually crisis pregnancy centres who are now journeying with the mothers. And I know a lot of churches run, it's quite amazing, people forget this, a huge percentage of the aid work that is done to people in need, and that includes commonly mothers in need, solo mums on their own. It's being provided by Christianity. It's the Christian churches. People are very fond of attacking and criticising and calling Christians all sorts of names and what's religion ever done that's good in the world and all that kind of cheap, childish nonsense. Yeah. Well, for example, right now, here's an interesting stat. Approximately 1/3, it's just under 30%, but approximately 1/3 of all the HIV/AIDS care is provided by Christian institutions in the world. So what's Christianity done that's good for the world? It's done that. Yeah. So it's gave us the hospital system. It did all those things. And so that natural care for mothers carries on too, and that maternal care and caring for them as the child ages. A lot of churches are doing that as well. And if someone's watching who's in a church and your church is not doing that, ask them, well, what can we do to actually get involved in that?
Mm-hmm. And that actually leads on to the last question I have for you, Brendan, which is, how can we be moving forward and loving the child and the mother and the father and everyone who's involved? How can both someone who may be listening who's pro-choice, what would you say to them? And what would you say to someone who's maybe pro-life?
I think it's important. Well, I'd say, first of all, for both sides actually of this, that your arguments that you make about the morality of abortion, they are arguments. And, you might cling to them quite strongly. But we're talking here about real persons and real lives. So we're talking about real mothers. We're talking about real unborn human beings who get killed every time an abortion takes place. So the question is, are we going to move from just the theoretical into the practical? So both sides, we can't afford to sit solely in the theoretical realm of ideas, but you can't detach yourself from ideas either, because the ideas inform your practical actions. Yeah. And if your ideas are not conformed to truth, then you're going to act in ways that are not good. So ideas do matter, but you can't stay in that theoretical realm. And I think that's a challenge for all of us. Consider the situation. So if you're pro-life, think about the mothers and the couples and the families who are in these situations and what can we do to help them. If you're pro-choice, think about the actual fact that the unborn child is lost. It's not simply a freedom, my body, my choice thing. Someone else's body is destroyed every time there's an abortion. And that's why the my body, my choice argument is so weak. Yeah. Because and I think it is, you should never do harm to someone else's body. You should never do something to their body without their consent. And that's absolutely true, because human bodies are sacred, because human persons are sacred. Now, if we're going to use that argument and say, well, my body, my choice, then guess what? We could never justify abortion, because abortion destroys the body without their consent of an unborn human being. So we need to have their permission before we do anything to their body. So the whole thing is a bit of a shell game, if you like. But what I mean is that pro-choice person, I'd say, I'd encourage you, come out of just the argument and think about the fact, there's a real human being, and I was once that human being. Yeah. I was in that womb once. Does my life matter? And so those kind of things. Secondly, I would say, I think that we need to really work to have and provide and care for those, and provide, create spaces where people are cared for when they're vulnerable. Because I think what happens is, as I've said, society rushes people towards abortion. It's like, we've got an answer to that problem of unplanned pregnancy, have an abortion, and you're free. And it's not the answer. It's just adding violence to that situation. So what can we do to get people off that conveyor belt and have genuine care provided to people? And I think that's a really challenging one, because abortion has become like this solution now to every problem involving an unplanned pregnancy and that's not good. And it doesn't help us in medicine. It doesn't help us in care. It doesn't help people in society. It's not a good thing. It's just creating a whole lot of victims and doing harm to people's lives. And so that our humanitarian heart and ethos is destroyed by abortion, and I think we need to realise that. I think also there's an interesting issue here about ensuring that if you're pro-life, you actually earn the right to speak about this with people. And what I mean by that is, you don't pay the money, or look, I'll take you out for dinner and then I'll tell you about abortion ethics. Yeah. No, what I mean is that you earn that right, I think, by actually walking the talk. So if you're not prepared to love people in desperate need when they've got an unplanned pregnancy, I don't think it's particularly helpful or healthy to be just constantly talking about the ethics and morality of abortion and passing judgment without actually helping. I think the other way you earn it is by your love and your friendship. So I have a conversation with someone. When I talk about this issue, I'm not trying to win an argument. I used to, and that was never good. And I used to think, I'm going to win an argument, but that's not right. I don't want to win an argument when I talk to someone who's pro-choice or pro-abortion. I actually want to have a genuine dialogue with that person, and my hope is that our dialogue will lead to good outcomes, in fact, better outcomes for mothers and their unborn children. And that's why I'm having the conversation. So it's about a mindset change, and I think our culture doesn't help that now. Often on social media, watch Nick own Brendan, or, Brendan gets owned, or Brendan gets wrecked by pro-life commentator. That kind of stuff doesn't help. And this destroying and owning type culture. No, we should be looking for dialogue, and that dialogue should be, I think, always about a greater humanity. And I think that's how you earn the right to speak about it. If you just turn up to a party full of strangers and say, right, let's talk about abortion and how it's evil, I don't think you've earned the right for that conversation. Mm-hmm. It might happen in that party, but I think you've got to earn the right by being genuinely humane and caring and loving and looking for dialogue with people, and as the conversation flows, having the conversation that way.
Yeah, so I guess walking the talk and...
Yeah, so important. Because people see through. If you've got someone who says, morality this, morality that, and they don't live that morality, we all know that. It doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum or whether you've got faith or not, you know that integrity matters. And if you see a person who's got integrity, this is the funny thing about my work. I honestly, I bang my head on the table often now, is that it's not uncommon you hear about some celebrity pastor or celebrity Christian or celebrity pro-life person or whatever, who has just acted in a way that's really not morally good at all and very serious. And you see the hypocrisy in it, and I bang my head on the table and I think, this is crazy. Part of it probably is we chase the celebrity a little bit too much. Yeah. And so for me, one of the things I've always been very clear with audiences I've spoken to, I've said, if I'm honest with you, I would much rather be just a husband, a father who owns a farm somewhere, farming because it's in my blood, it's in my family, and who just lives and raises kids on a farm somewhere quietly, and no one knows who I am, and I'm not on a podcast with you today talking about controversial issues, but that's not the path that was chosen for me. So I have to walk this path because this is the calling, but if I was honest, that's what I'd like to be. And I think there's something important. I try and maintain that attitude because I think that helps us recognize that integrity matters, and humility is a big part of that integrity. So it's not about destroying people, it's not about winning arguments. It's about having the humility to recognise that you're dealing with and you're engaging with a human person, whether that's a human person in a womb or whether that's a human person who wants to argue about abortion with you.
Yeah. No, awesome. That's great stuff, Brendan. So thank you very much for coming onto the podcast and sharing with us all, I guess, how we are to have these conversations with people about abortion. And I love that final point you made about how we should have a mindset change, and rather than just try to arguments and win debates, instead we should be thinking, how can we be loving and caring more for the mother and the child and everyone else involved in the situation. So just before we finish, how can the listeners of The Garrison or the viewers of The Garrison, how can they listen to your stuff, Brendan?
Well, for those who are interested, I have a few little... I have an independent media venture. I was going to say a few little social media irons in the fire, but I have a few. It's all part of something called Left Foot Media. Yeah. So you can find that at Watch LFM, so Left Foot Media, LFM. So WATCH, watchlfm.com, and that'll take you to the website. And on the website there, there's links to various video interviews I've done. I also have a YouTube channel called Left Foot Media, and if you look that up, you'll find previously I did a lot of commentaries and reviews and often movie related and TV related and talking about issues like that. So it was sort of a mix of social and movie reviews. Yeah. And so there's a whole lot of that content on there if people are interested. I imagine some of your viewers might be. There's a bit of crossover. I made my bones talking about like the awfulness of The Last Jedi, or what I thought was the awfulness of The Last Jedi. Maybe that's too controversial, even more controversial than abortion is talking about The Last Jedi. But things like that, and the stuff that I do now with Left Foot Media is more like I have a regular podcast called The Dispatches that I publish on a weekly basis, and my patrons who become $5 a month patrons, they can get access to 2 exclusive 1-hour podcasts every week and other stuff. So it's really sort of growing, and I do a regular monthly live stream as well through Left Foot Media with National MP Simon O'Connor and another guy, Elliot O'Kelly, and we just talk about sort of political issues, current affairs. Now, some of your viewers might not be interested in that, but some of it might be really intriguing, and you can go and sort of pick and choose and say, oh, yeah, I'm interested in that topic that he talked about on the Dispatches podcast. And so, yeah, watch lfm.com.
Yeah, personally, I know I'm going to have to go and look at the Last Jedi review.
Yeah, all the good work I've done here today might be completely undermined, and everyone goes, oh my gosh, he didn't like it. So and Marvel was the other thing. I used to talk a lot about Marvel and DC. And I, to be fair, one of the other one of my big traffic moments was when I came out in defense of Batman v Superman, and a lot of people were like, "How dare you? That movie was awful." So
I can imagine the comment section might be even more vile than some of the.
Oh yeah, I stopped looking. So yeah, but I think for me, this is the beauty of social media, is the ability to I think engage with people and ideas, and even like often entertainment too.
Yeah.
And one of the things I try and do is encourage people to think more deeply about the entertainment that we're watching and what are some of the big themes there that really matter.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. So make sure to go check out Brendan on his Left Foot Media and all the various different podcasts and YouTube bits and pieces that he does. So thanks again, Brendan. I really hope you guys as the audience have taken away lots from this conversation. I know I have. So we'll see you next time on the Garrison.